Welcome back. Let's dive into Chapter 7 on thinking and intelligence, a topic that honestly shapes every part of our daily life, whether we realize it or not. So, when we talk about cognitive psychology, we're talking about the study of how we think. It's about how your brain processes everything from recognizing a face to solving a math problem to choosing what to eat for dinner. All of that falls under cognition. So, what exactly is cognition? At its most basic level, cognition is thinking, but it's not just random thoughts. It includes a whole group of mental processes like perception, knowledge, problem solving, judgment, language, and memory. Cognitive psychology is all about how these processes work, both separately and together, to shape our understanding of the world and ourselves. So think about the last time you were making a decision, like choosing between two job offers or even something simple like whether to stay in or go out. Which of these cognitive processes do you think were involved in making those decisions? So, how does cognition actually work? We take in information through our senses, so the things that we see, hear, smell, and the things that people say to us. And that information gets filtered through our emotions, our memories, and our past experiences. Then it becomes a thought. From there, those thoughts shape our behavior and the things that we do. But it's not just about what we think, it's also about how we got there. And that's what cognitive psychology tries to understand. This is why two people can experience the exact same situation and respond in completely different ways. Their internal filters, their emotions, past experiences, and stored knowledge are different, and that changes how they think and how they behave. So let's talk about how the brain organizes information because we're constantly taking in new stuff and somehow our brain manages it and makes it manageable. So we do this by forming concepts. A concept is just a mental category. It's a way to group similar things together. That could be objects, ideas, experiences, or even people. For example, the concept of dog includes hundreds of different breeds, sizes, temperaments, but we recognize them as part of the same general category. Concepts help us make sense of new information quickly. They let us recognize patterns, predict outcomes, and know how to respond. Now, within each concept, we often have a prototype, the best or most typical example of that concept. So if I say bird, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably maybe something like a robin or a blue jay or a cardinal. Something small, feathered, and flying. That's your prototype. But a penguin? That fits the concept of bird, but it doesn't match the prototype. And so your brain might take a second longer to categorize it. Here's another example. If I say civil disobedience, you might think of someone like Gandhi. He's a prototype for that concept, someone whose actions define it in a clear, recognizable way. And there are other types of concepts as well. We have natural concepts and artificial concepts. A natural concepts are ones that we form through direct experience. You learn what snow is by seeing it, touching it, or even just hearing about it, often enough to create a mental image. These concepts are flexible. They're based on observation, not strict rules. Artificial concepts, on the other hand, are defined by a specific set of characteristics. Think math or geometry. A square has four equal sides and four right angles. That's not open to interpretation. It either fits or it doesn't. We use both kinds of concepts all the time. Natural concepts help us navigate real world experiences, while artificial concepts help us solve problems or communicate more clearly in structured ways, like in science, engineering, or law. Another way our brain organizes information is through schemata or schemas. A schema is a mental framework. It's a collection of related concepts that help us make quick judgments about people, situations, or things based on what we've seen before. For example, if I say classroom, you probably picture desks, a teacher, maybe a whiteboard. That's a schema. It helps you understand what to expect without having to start from scratch every single time. And there are different types of schemas. One is a role schema. This helps us make assumptions about how someone in a specific role is likely to behave. So think about a librarian. What comes to mind? quiet, maybe older, perhaps they're wearing glasses. That's your role schema filling in the gaps, and sometimes those assumptions can be way off. Then there's an event schema, also called a cognitive script. This is a set of behaviors that can feel automatic in certain situations. For example, when you walk into an elevator, you probably turn around and face the door. You don't stop and think about it. It's just what you do. That's an event schema. Schemas help us move through the world efficiently, but they can also make us rely on assumptions that aren't always accurate. Event schemas are automatic behaviors we were just talking about. So these can be really hard to change because they become habits, and they often kick in whether the situation is appropriate or not. So take texting, for example. Most of us have a strong event schema around our phones. If we hear a notification or feel a vibration, we instinctively check it, no matter where we are. This becomes a problem when the automatic behavior puts us in danger, like texting while driving. Even though we know it's unsafe, the schema is so strong that it feels natural to pick up the phone without even thinking about it. Research has found that just the habit of regularly checking our phones makes it harder to resist the urge, even when we're behind the wheel. That's how powerful event schemas can be. So while they help us function in daily life, they can also lead to risky or unhelpful behavior when we're not paying attention. One of the most powerful cognitive tools we have is language. Language is a system that we use to communicate, not just through words, but through structure and meaning. It lets us share our ideas, emotions, and information with each other. There are a few key components that make up language. Lexicon is just the vocabulary of language, all of the words that we use and know. Grammar are the rules for how we organize those words to create meaning. Then we get into the building blocks of language like phonemes, the smallest units of sound. So, for example, the sounds ah, ah, or eh, eh, or sh, sh. Morphemes are the smallest units of meaning. These can be whole words or parts of words like un or ed. And language also depends on semantics, the meaning behind words and phrases, and also syntax, which is the rules for how we structure sentences. So when you're forming a sentence, your brain is drawing from your lexicon, applying grammar rules, arranging the phonemes and morphemes, and checking that the syntax makes sense. And you're doing all of that in a split second in real time. So, where does our ability to use language even come from? Well, according to Chomsky, humans are actually biologically wired for language. He believed that we're born with an innate ability to acquire language. It's not something we have to be explicitly taught, at least not in the way that we teach other skills. Chomsky argued that language follows similar patterns across cultures and backgrounds. This idea supports the concept of a universal grammar, the idea that all human languages share some underlying structure. He also introduced the idea of a critical period for language development, a specific window early in life when we're most able to learn language. If we miss that window, learning language later becomes much harder or even impossible in some ways. One of the most well-known examples of this is the case of Jeannie. Jeannie was the girl who was found at age 13 after experiencing extreme abuse and neglect. She had been isolated for most of her life and had virtually no exposure to language during those early years. After she was rescued, she was able to start learning words and could build a vocabulary, but she was never able to fully grasp grammar or sentence structure, which are the more complex parts of language. This supports the idea that those early years are essential for developing full language fluency. Language just doesn't appear all at once. It develops in stages, starting in infancy and progressing through early childhood. This chart outlines the typical milestones most children hit between birth and age 5. Stage 1 is from 0 to 3 months. This is where babies begin to coo and make reflexive sounds. They also respond to voices, especially familiar ones. Stage 2 is from 3 to 8 months. Now we start to hear babbling, strings of sounds like baba and dada. They're not words yet, but they're practicing. At stage 3, we're 8 to 13 months. Babies begin to form intentional sounds. This is when we start hearing first words like mama or ball. They also understand simple instructions and gestures. Stage 4 is from 12 to 18 months. This is where vocabulary starts to grow. Children might use one or two word phrases and express meaning like milk or go car or outside. At stage 5, we are 18 to 24 months. We see a large language explosion. Vocabulary rapidly expands, and kids begin combining two or more words into very simple sentences. In stage 6, we are 2 to 3 years old. Grammar starts to develop here. Children begin using plurals, simple questions, and more complete sentences. And then we reach stage 7, which is ages 3 to 5 years old, and this is where language becomes much more refined. Most children can now carry on conversations, understand basic rules of grammar, and use language to express more abstract ideas. Of course, every child develops at their own pace, but these stages give us a general framework of what to expect. Language development is a huge part of cognitive growth, and it lays the foundation for everything else we do with our minds. So now we'll shift gears a little bit to talk about problem solving and how we actually figure things out when there's a challenge in front of us. There's several strategies that people tend to use depending on the situation. We have trial and error, which is pretty straightforward. This is where you keep trying different solutions until something works. It's not the most efficient method, but sometimes it's all we've got. Think about trying to remember your friend's phone passcode. You try a few combinations until you get it right, trial, error, and eventually you have success. An algorithm is a step-by-step formula or procedure that guarantees a correct result as long as you follow it exactly. So, for example, a recipe is an algorithm. Same with long division. These methods might take a little bit longer, but they're more reliable. A heuristic is more like a shortcut. It's a general rule of thumb that helps you make quick decisions without having to go through every step. It doesn't guarantee a perfect solution, but it usually works well enough. So, for example, when you're grocery shopping and pick the shortest line without counting how many items each person has, you're using a heuristic here. And then we have working backwards. This strategy starts with the end goal and works in reverse to figure out how to get there. It's especially useful when the steps to solve the problem aren't very clear. Say you want to graduate in 2 years. You figure out what courses you need to take, then map out each semester working backwards from your goal. So, but how do we decide which strategy to use in the different situations that we find ourselves in? Well, most people rely on heuristics when there's too much information, when time may be limited, the decision isn't super important, there's not a lot of data available, or when a familiar shortcut just comes to mind in the moment. So let's look at a puzzle. Sudoku. Some of you are probably familiar with Sudoku, and some of you have probably thought there's no way I'm going to do this ever because it's numbers and maths, right? But if you haven't played before, this is a number puzzle where you fill in the blanks so that every row, column, and box contain all of the digits from 1 to 9 without repeating. So why am I showing you this in a general psychology class? Because Sudoku is a perfect example of problem solving in action. You can approach it in a few different ways. Some people will start with trial and error, just plugging in numbers until they find one that works. Others use more of an algorithm, carefully following the logical rules of the game step by step. And sometimes you'll use a heuristic, like filling in the easiest or most obvious numbers first to narrow things down more quickly. Sudoku shows us how we naturally lean towards certain strategies and how practice can improve our problem solving skills over time. And now our second puzzle. You've probably seen this one before. Connect all 9 dots using just 4 straight lines without lifting your pencil from the paper. At first glance, it feels impossible. Most people try to stay inside the square made by the dots, and that's where they get stuck. But here's the catch, the only way to solve it is to think outside of the box, literally. The solution requires drawing lines that extend beyond the square of the dots. This puzzle is a classic demonstration of how our brains create mental boundaries and blocks, even when no one tells us that they're there. We limit ourselves without realizing it, and it shows how powerful it can be to take a step back, question our assumptions, and change the way that we approach problems. The completed grid is now shown here. Use it to compare your moves. A few keys that you likely used or can notice now are singles only options. So cells where just one number could possibly fit in. You might have also done scanning by row, column, or box to eliminate the candidates systematically. Or pencil marks, which promotes an algorithmic approach rather than pure trial and error. The solution to the nine dots is, you can see here, goes outside and extends beyond the barrier, and you could do this without having to lift your pencil at all. It's pretty cool. The idea here is that you have to go beyond the box made by the dots and also our mental barrier sometimes. That's the only way that they can ever cover all 9 points with just the 4 lines. And even though we have lots of strategies for solving problems, sometimes our thinking just gets in the way. These are called pitfalls. Two big ones are functional fixedness and mental set. Functional fixedness is when we get stuck seeing an object only in its usual role, and we can't imagine it being used any differently. So, for example, you have a candle, some thumbtacks, and a box of matches. The goal is to attach the candle to the wall so it can burn safely. Most people don't think to use the box as a candle holder. Instead, they focus on only on its usual function, storing matches. That's functional fixedness. You're locked into one idea of what an object is used for, and it blocks creative solutions. A mental set happens when you keep trying to solve a problem the same way you've solved similar ones in the past, even when that approach no longer is working. So, for example, let's say you always restart your computer whenever something goes wrong. That usually fixes it. But one day, restarting doesn't solve the issue. You keep trying it over and over and over anyway. Einstein summed it up well. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. These pitfalls remind us that problem solving isn't just about the strategies that we know, it's also about being flexible enough to break out of old habits when we find that they're not working for us anymore. And even when we think we're being logical, our decision making can be influenced by cognitive biases, mental shortcuts that can lead us off track. So let's look at a few of the most common ones. An anchoring bias happens when we rely too heavily on the first piece of information that we're given. So, for example, if the first car you look at costs $35,000, every other price you see will feel cheap by comparison, even if it's still expensive. Confirmation bias is when we tend to look for information that supports what we already believe, and we ignore any evidence that doesn't support what we believe. For example, if you believe a certain diet is the best, you'll notice articles and posts praising it while brushing off studies that suggest otherwise. Hindsight bias is the I knew it all along effect. After something happens, it feels like it was predictable. For example, after a football game, fans say, of course that team won. It was obvious, even though the outcome wasn't certain at all. And if you've ever heard or said the expression, hindsight is always 2020, where a lot of times we're able to see, ah, yes, there is the pattern of what led to this outcome, even though we didn't notice it at the time. Representative bias is when we unintentionally stereotype based on how well something seems to fit into a category. So, for example, if you meet someone quiet and studious, you might assume they're a librarian rather than, say, a firefighter, even though that's based on stereotypes and not facts. Our availability heuristic is when we make decisions based on what's easiest to recall and not necessarily what's most accurate. So, for example, after seeing news reports of plane crashes, some people are afraid to fly, even though statistically driving is far more dangerous. These biases help us make quick judgments, but they can also cloud our reasoning if we're not aware of them. Do you notice any of these biases showing up in your own life? Maybe in how you make decisions, what you choose to buy, or even how you interact with friends and family. It's an interesting thing to kind of think about. So let's talk about how psychologists have tried to define and measure intelligence. There's no single agreed upon definition, but here are two of the early major perspectives. Charles Spearman believed that intelligence was made up of one general factor, which he called G. This G factor explained why people who did well in one area, like math, often did well in others, like problem solving or reading. He thought intelligence was basically one underlying ability that applied across different tasks. And Raymond Cattell expanded on this by dividing intelligence into two categories. We have crystallized intelligence, which is the knowledge and skills that you gain from experiences and education. It's the things that you know. So, for example, remembering historical facts, knowing vocabulary, or using multiplication tables. And we also have fluid intelligence, which is the ability to think quickly, see patterns, and solve new problems. It's how you process. So, for example, figuring out how to fix a broken appliance without instructions or solving a puzzle that you've never seen before. Crystallized intelligence tends to grow as we age and gain more knowledge, while fluid intelligence often peaks in young adulthood and slowly declines over time. Robert Sternberg offered a different way of looking at intelligence. Instead of just one general factor, he proposed the triarchic theory of intelligence, which breaks intelligence down into three parts. Analytical intelligence, this is the kind of intelligence measured by traditional IQ tests, problem solving, logic, reasoning, and academic skills. So, for example, trying to solve math problems or analyzing arguments. Then there's also creative intelligence. This is about using imagination and innovation to deal with new situations. It's the thinking outside the box kind of intelligence. So, for example, finding a new recipe using only the random ingredients left in your fridge. And also practical intelligence, which is sometimes called street smarts. This is the ability to adapt to everyday life, manage tasks, and interact effectively with other people. For example, knowing how to talk your way out of a conflict or how to fix something around the house without formal training. Sternberg's idea highlights that intelligence isn't just about doing well on tests, it's also about how we use our skills in real world situations. Howard Gardner proposed that intelligence isn't just one thing. Instead, he argued that each person has multiple intelligences, at least 8 distinct kinds. And the ones he identified are linguistic, which is the skills with words and language, logical or mathematical, which is reasoning, logic, and numbers, musical, which is rhythm, sound, and pitch, bodily kinesthetic, which is using the body to solve problems or create things like athletes, dancers, surgeons, spatial, which is visualizing and manipulating space. Artists, architects, and pilots fall into this one usually. Interpersonal, which is understanding and relating to others. Intrapersonal, which is understanding yourself, your feelings, and your motivations. And naturalists, recognizing and working with patterns in nature. Often we talk about interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligence together as emotional intelligence. That's the ability to understand your own emotions, recognize others' emotions, show empathy, and respond appropriately in different social situations. The main takeaway from Gardner's theory is that people aren't smart or not smart in a uniform way. Everyone has different areas of strength, and traditional IQ tests don't usually capture the full picture of human ability. So let's dive into creativity, which is the ability to generate new ideas, solutions, or possibilities. Creative people usually share a few traits. They have deep knowledge in a specific area, often built over years. They look for novel, unique solutions instead of the obvious ones. They aren't afraid to take risks. They often collaborate with or learn from others to expand their perspective. When we talk about creativity, we usually are looking at two types of thinking. We have divergent thinking, which is thinking outside the box. It's when you come up with many possible solutions to a problem. So, an example here would be brainstorming all of the different uses for a paperclip. And convergent thinking, this is about narrowing down to the simple best solution. So, figuring out the correct answer on a multiple choice test. Both types are very important. Divergent thinking sparks new ideas, while convergent thinking helps us focus and choose what works best. But let's look at how psychologists have tried to measure intelligence. One of the earliest and most famous tools was the Stanford Binet intelligence test. This test was designed to measure a person's intelligence quotient or IQ. An IQ score is a standardized number that's meant to reflect someone's overall cognitive ability compared to other people. The average IQ is set at 100. Scores above or below that show how someone's abilities compare to the population. To make sure these tests are meaningful, psychologists use two important processes. One is standardization, which is making sure the test is given and scored the same way every single time. This ensures fairness to everyone who takes the test. And norming, which is giving the test to a large sample of people so we know what average actually looks like. This way, an individual's score can be compared to a reliable reference group. Together, standardization and norming help make sure that the test results are accurate, consistent, and useful for comparing across individuals. So this is Alfred Binet, the French psychologist who started developing intelligence testing. In the early 1900s, the French government asked Binet to help identify children who might be struggling in school and need extra support. To do this, he created one of the very first intelligence tests. Binet's test focused on tasks like memory, attention, and problem solving, things that related to school performance. He never intended it to be used as a fixed measure of someone's potential or worth. Instead, it was meant as a practical tool to guide education. Later, his work was adapted in the United States into what became the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scale, which is still used in different forms today. So when we talk about IQ testing, it all traces back to Binet's efforts to give students the help that they needed to succeed. After Binet, other psychologists built on his work to create new ways of measuring intelligence. One of the most influential was David Wechsler. In 1939, he developed the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, or the WAIS. His definition of intelligence was much broader: the global capacity of a person to act purposefully, to think rationally, and to deal effectively with the environment. The WAIS included a variety of subtests measuring verbal skills, visual spatial reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. This gave a fuller picture of someone's abilities rather than just one overall score. Today, updated versions like the WISC-5 are used with children. Another important finding in intelligence research is something called the Flynn effect. Researchers notice that average IQ scores have been rising steadily over the past century. Each new generation tends to score higher than the last. There's a debate about why this happens, but possible explanations include better nutrition, more access to education, and increased exposure to complex problem solving in everyday life. So now let's look at how we measure intelligence across populations. So the results tend to follow what's called a bell curve or a normal distribution. In this picture, we have a graph shaped like a hill or a bell. Most people's scores cluster in the middle, around the average, and fewer people fall at the very high or very low ends. In psychological testing, this curve shows how traits like IQ are distributed in the population. So to make this work, researchers rely on representative samples, which is a large group that accurately reflects the population as a whole. That way, the curve is meaningful and not skewed. So when you hear that someone is average in intelligence, it's not an insult. It literally means they fall in the largest group right in the middle of the bell curve. So looking at the IQ scores on bell curve, the average IQ is set at 100. And from there, scores are measured in units called standard deviations, each one representing 15 points when it comes to IQ. So a score of 85 to 115 is considered average, and about 82% of the population is going to fall within this range. Scores significantly above or below that range are much less common. So when you see the bell curve, remember most people are clustered near the middle, and only a small percentage score very high or very low. This curve is why IQ scores are really useful. They give us a way to compare an individual's performance to a larger population in a standardized way. So we've looked at how to measure intelligence, but where does intelligence actually come from? Is it something that we inherit from our parents, or is it shaped by our environment? And this is the classic nature versus nurture debate. From the nature perspective, intelligence is largely genetic, which is passed down biologically from parents to children. From the nurture perspective, intelligence is shaped by experiences, our environment, and opportunities, things like education, nutrition, and stimulation in childhood. Most psychologists today agree that it's both. Intelligence develops through an interaction of genetics and environment. One way to explain this is the range of reaction theory. It says each of us have a genetically determined potential for intelligence, like a range we're capable of reaching. But where we actually land within that range depends on our environment. For example, a child might be born with the potential for high intelligence, but if they grow up with little access to education or proper nutrition, they may not reach that full potential. On the other hand, supportive environments can help individuals get closer to the top of their range. Here we can see some of the evidence for the genetic side of intelligence. Researchers often look at twin studies to tease apart nature and nurture. The logic is this: identical twins share the same DNA, while fraternal twins only share about half, like regular siblings. Identical twins raised together tend to have very similar IQ scores. Identical twins raised apart also show strong correlations, which suggests genetic influence. Fraternal twins or regular siblings raised together usually have lower correlations than identical twins. What this shows is that there's definitely a genetic component to intelligence, but environment still matters. The fact that identical twins raised apart don't have identical IQs proves that experience and upbringing play a role as well. So again, we see that combination, genetics set the potential, and environment influences how much of that potential is reached. When we talk about intelligence, it's important to remember that test scores don't capture everything about how people think and learn. Learning disabilities are cognitive disorders that affect specific areas of functioning, often language or reading, even in people with average or above average intelligence. These aren't the same as intellectual disabilities. Instead, they're targeted difficulties in certain processes. So the two common types are dysgraphia and dyslexia. Dysgraphia affects writing. People with dysgraphia may know exactly what they want to say, but struggle to physically put their thoughts on paper or in a clear way. Handwriting may be messy, slow, or inconsistent. And dyslexia affects reading. Dyslexia makes it hard to correctly process letters and words. For example, letters might appear reversed or jumbled. It's the most common learning disability in children, and it often shows up when they're first learning how to read. Learning disabilities often occur alongside other conditions as well, and that's what we call a comorbidity. For example, a child with dyslexia may also have attention difficulties. But remember this, having a learning disability does not mean a person isn't intelligent. With support and the right strategies, many people with learning disabilities excel academically and professionally. So that is all for chapter 7. We've looked at how we think, how we solve problems, and the different ways psychologists define and measure intelligence.